Get ready, because not only is it extremely satisfying to watch these things shatter in slow motion, we also get to learn a little something about adhesives, bond strength, and getting the right aquascaping adhesive tool the first time. Just how strong is your aquascape bond after 24 hours of curing? Does it matter whether the rocks are wet versus dry? When should you use epoxy over mortar or over superglue? Well, that's what this BRStv Investigates is all about. Today we have a 3-part experiment to put these 7 different aquascaping adhesive combinations to the test: Jurassic Gel with and without Instaset, BRS Extra Thick Superglue with and without Instaset, Marco Rocks Aquascaping Mortar, 2 Little Fishies Aquastick Epoxy, and our own sticky hybrid combo of BRS Superglue, Instaset, and Marco Mortar sandwiched together. The first 2 experiments are simple. Cut off some branches of real reef rock, secure the smooth sides back together, and see if the bonding agent is strong enough to hold them together through several stress tests. The catch here is that the first set of branch rocks will be cut dry, glued back together, and cured for 24 hours. However, the second set will be soaked in salt water for 72 hours, then cut, glued, cured in air for 20 minutes, then dropped back underwater to continue curing for another 24 hours. What we're looking for in the first 2 tests is to ID which bonds hold the strongest when there's less surface area for the adhesives to bond to, basically taking away the adhesive's ability to gain strength from mechanical interlocking adhesion. On top of that, we're adding in the variable of salt water to see what impact, if any, it will have on that same smooth surface bond. The third experiment today is the really fun part, where we build 7 similar arching aquascapes using dry rock, bond them together with each adhesive combo, let them cure overnight, and then we try our best to break them into tiny piles of rock rubble and see which one holds on the strongest. So let's dive right into the first test results with the dry branch experiment, starting with the Jurassic Gel Superglue, which has a long history of being one of the top superglue choices specifically for aquascaping. First, we wanted to see if the bond could support the weight of the branch base, so we held the structure off the table for a few seconds, and to no surprise, the Jurassic Gel held firmly. Next, we upped the stress test level and gave the bond a vigorous handshake, where the Jurassic Superglue bond wound up breaking pretty easily. Upon closer inspection, you can actually see where the glue itself failed, as it indicated by that jagged, cracked glue left over on both sides of the branch. But what if we spritz a little Instaset glue accelerator on both smooth surfaces before adding the Jurassic Gel? Will it cure the bond faster, make it more brittle? Let's find out. In the weight support test, the Jurassic Gel and Instaset combo held up just fine. However, just like the gel without Instaset, it failed pretty easily at the handshake test. Next up, we have the BRS Extra Thick Gel, both with and without Instaset, and I'll save you the suspense here. There wasn't much difference between the Jurassic Gel results. However, take a closer look at the BRS Gel only branch. There's actually a sizable chunk of rock that seemed to fail along with the glue, which would lead me to believe that it may have had a stronger bond, which could be due to a possible difference in cyanoacrylate forms, or that it might have different toughening agents added in, but we'll discuss that a little bit deeper in just a bit. Next up in the dry rock test is 2 Little Fishies Epoxy, where after following the mixing instructions and a 24-hour cure, it breezed through the weight test and the handshake test, and was actually surprisingly tough to break apart in the next level of stress testing, where I used brute force to break apart the bond. With as much force as it took to break that epoxy bond, I was actually surprised that we didn't see the epoxy holding onto a chunk of rock like the BRS Gel did. On the other hand, the Marco Mortar also passed the weight and handshake test and took slightly less effort than the epoxy to break apart with brute force. However, the aftermath shows mortar material residue left on both rock surfaces. So in this test, with dry rock cut in half, I'd have to give the strongest bond award to the epoxy, but we're not done yet. Let's see how each of these same bonds perform when a rock has been soaked, cut, bonded, and set to cure underwater for 24 hours. Similar to the first test, the Jurassic Gel on its own didn't make it past the handshake test. However, the Jurassic Gel and Instaset this time failed before we even got it out of the water. These were interesting results compared to the wet rock testing of the BRS Gel and Instaset, Not only did both BRS gel options pass the weight test, they also passed the handshake test, but they finally failed after some heavy convincing with brute force. So initially, it would seem that the water actually assisted the BRS gel bond strength, while at the same time rendering the Jurassic gel somewhat weaker. But why could that be? Maybe they're different forms of cyanoacrylate, like either methyl 2-cyanoacrylate or ethyl 2-cyanoacrylate. Or do they have different types of ratios of toughening agents like rubber and anhydride? Unfortunately, it's difficult to answer those questions since there isn't much information shared for either glue type. However, the two certainly show different properties, specifically when dry. The Jurassic gel looks to cure crystal clear, while the BRS gel seems to cure more opaque or cloudy. Now onto the epoxy and mortar wet branch test. The results were completely opposite of the dry branch test. The epoxy fell apart as soon as it went back into the water for the 24-hour cure, and although the mortar still had some residue on the branch, the majority of it disintegrated into a pile at the bottom of the bucket. After these results, I'd say that for gluing wet rocks back together and curing them underwater, BRS Superglue Gel takes home the trophy on this one. I can't say for sure exactly why just yet without testing further, but my guess would be that it has something to do with the reactive curing process of cyanoacrylate, which is activated by moisture, but we'll have to keep testing to learn more. So now we get to the fun part where we get to smash these aquascapes in our third adhesive strength test. Will epoxy remain number one as the dry bonding agent? Will gobs of superglue cure completely through in just 24 hours? Will the hybrid combo of glue, Instaset, and Marco mortar dominate as the aquascaping adhesive champion? You be the judge. After building 7 of these archways and letting each adhesive cure for 24 hours, we roll out this experiment in 4 phases. Phase 1, we'll pick up the aquascape from 2 points of contact near the base. Phase 2, we'll pick it up by this single rock archway. Phase 3, we'll drop the whole thing from a foot above the table. And Phase 4, if any of them make it that far, we'll drop the entire aquascape from 5 feet down to the ground. Again, we start with the Jurassic Gel Superglue on its own, and before I even pick up the aquascape for Phase 1, I already notice areas where thick globs of glue are still tacky and not fully cured. And as I lift it from 2 points of contact, some of the joints feel flimsy and pliable, but surprisingly, it actually holds together. But those weak bonds don't last long, however, because on Phase 2, single point pickup, the whole thing falls apart with a resounding fail. Basically, the exact same story plays out on both aquascapes using Jurassic Gel and Instaset, as well as BRS Extra Thick Glue and Instaset. Joints not fully cured, flimsy in Test 1, and a complete failure in Test Phase 2. The real surprise here was the BRS Extra Thick Glue on its own. It also had a couple tacky joints and uncured joints and felt slightly flimsy in Test Phase 1, but it actually held up all the way to the 1-foot drop test where finally it crashed and burned. Honestly, I'd bet if we gave these another 24 hours to cure, we probably would have seen a completely different story. Let's quickly take a closer look at the joints of each of these superglue combos. Not only were there spots left tacky and uncured, what looks to be happening with the Instaset is that it chemically hardens the outside of the superglue mass, leaving the inside still tacky and uncured, seemingly slowing the overall cure time. Perhaps it's blocking moisture from getting into the core of the joint or something completely different altogether. Up next is Marco mortar, and immediately it's apparent that this bond is fully dried and feels far stronger than the superglue options. That said, it breezed through Test 1 and Test 2 without any sign of failing bonds, but when I drop it from a foot, although it looks to be in one nice single piece, when I pick it up from the table, we actually see that the bond was broken. Upon closer inspection, it actually looks like the rock itself and the surrounding mortar failed rather than just the mortar bond, which leads me to believe that the cement-like bond was so strong, the shock wave from the fall traveled through the structure and found the weakest point being a small 1-inch bit of rock held together by some mortar. Before I get to the surprise top performer today, I'm going to jump ahead here and share that our dream of a super glue adhesive Instaset mortar hybrid also failed in a similar fashion to the mortar only test, and actually slightly worse. The joints shared multiple failure characteristics of both superglue and mortar. Some joints weren't fully cured and others looked like the rock sheared away. Okay, so I have to be honest here and say up front that between Ryan, Brent, myself, the epoxy was our least favored to make it through the Aquascape demolition test. Maybe our predictions were skewed by our own negative experiences trying to use epoxy on wet rocks and then watching them fail to cure fully underwater. However, neither of us actually used it on dry rock with a 24-hour dry cure. With that in mind, the epoxy stunned each of us through test 1, 2, and even 3, where it was the only structure to pass the 1-foot drop test unscathed. And even after a 5-foot drop, I was astonished to see some joints still intact. My guess as to why the epoxy took the gold in this third test comes down to flexibility. Although we probably wouldn't be able to tell with 100% certainty that the epoxy has slightly more give than the mortar without an expensive high-speed camera, it certainly seems that even a small amount of flex in the adhesive material helped to absorb those shock waves of falling just enough to keep the bonded joints together. So have I been wrong to not recommend epoxy to reefers all these years? Are there benefits to each one of these that make them unique in their own way? Well, I will absolutely stand here and eat a little crow today and say that epoxy is definitely a great choice for creating extremely durable dry aquascaping bonds with a couple caveats. Epoxy wouldn't be my first or second choice if working with wet or damp rock, and because the final epoxy texture tends to look a little unnatural in the tank, if I were attempting to create completely hidden joints like Ryan did in this 120-gallon NSA Aquascape tutorial video, mortar with a little super glue and some sand grains can transform hundreds of tiny little rock rubble bits into one stunning, seamless aquascape you're sure to be proud of. So check out how it's done right over here.